Hey guys, tonight let's dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe wrap yourself in a soft blanket, and set sail. Not on any old adventure, but into the surprisingly mundane and often ridiculous lives of pirates. Because, yes, pirates. Those terrifying sea wolves of legend, whose names evoke rum, treasure, and terrible teeth, were actually kind of normal people. Well, as normal as people can be if they decide the Atlantic Ocean is their personal taxi service and tax laws are optional. So, let's start by sinking into the reality behind all those romanticized tales. You know the ones. Blackbeard with his flaming beard, Captain Hook twirling a mustache, chests of gold gleaming under the sun. Truth be told, actual pirate life was less Hollywood glamour and more damp, smelly, and occasionally miserable. Imagine sleeping on a plank, eating what's essentially wet bread and fish, and arguing for hours over who stole the last slice of salted pork. And yes, even with all that, they somehow became legends, mostly because people love a good story. Or maybe because they were horrifyingly messy humans with terrible dental hygiene. Let's float over to one of the earliest figures who helped shape the public imagination of piracy, Sir Francis Drake. Now, don't get too excited. He wasn't a pirate in the strictly hang-you-from-the-yardarm sense. Officially, he was a privateer, which is basically the polite, government-approved version of piracy. Same day job, slightly better wardrobe. Drake sailed for England in the late 1500s, plundering Spanish ships, claiming islands, and generally being a thorn in Spain's side. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, because apparently being a glorified thief makes you a hero if the crown approves. Drake's adventures were probably closer to a chaotic office job than swashbuckling theater. Ship maintenance? Tedious. Navigating storms? Annoying. Dealing with disgruntled crew? A nightmare. But when you read accounts, Drake comes across as dashing, clever, and audacious, which might explain why people forget that much of his career involved sitting in a soggy boat, slowly losing toe sensation. And yes, toe-related injuries on ships were more common than you'd think. Feet got wet, blistered, infected. A truly glamorous life. Now, while Drake had a royal stamp of approval, many pirates didn't. They were basically freelance chaos agents, unlicensed and unfiltered. Let's glide into Edward Lowe, a pirate whose reputation could inspire nightmares for the overly squeamish, or just serve as an example of how quickly power can inflate ego. Lowe started as a petty thief and somehow worked his way onto a ship, eventually taking over and embracing the pirate lifestyle fully. He was known for a level of cruelty that even contemporaries found excessive, but let's not dwell on the grisly details. Instead, notice the contrast. He terrorized ships, yet lived in constant discomfort. Imagine sleeping in a hammock, swaying over stormy seas, with a crew that might mutiny at any second because you're, well, Edward Lowe. It's kind of tragic, really. And here's an ironic twist. The fearsome reputation of pirates often came not from anything dramatic they did daily, but from clever, psychological branding. Take Calico Jack Rackham, famous for his checkered clothes. He wasn't the most terrifying pirate. In fact, by some accounts, he was a bit of a slacker and liked to play cards more than battle. But his flair for dramatic fashion made him memorable. Fear, in this case, was as much about marketing as it was about muscle. So if you want to scare people today, maybe you just need a striking outfit and an imposing name. Lesson: style matters, even on the high seas. Let's drift over to the lives of female pirates, because yes, they existed, and their stories are even more absurdly delightful. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are probably the most famous examples. Anne Bonny, an Irish woman with a fierce temper and apparently no respect for societal norms, joined Calico Jack's crew disguised as a man. Mary Read did the same. These ladies were not out there for treasure alone. They were rebelling against a world that insisted they sit quietly, sew, and be polite. And let's be honest, the idea of terrifying sailors who were probably not expecting a woman in full combat mode is quietly satisfying. Life for these women was still grueling. Long hours, dangerous voyages, and the constant threat of capture were real. But Anne and Mary clearly had a knack for theatrics and chaos, which makes them unforgettable. Anne, for instance, reportedly screamed at her enemies and scolded her crew like a schoolteacher on a bad Monday. Mary had a similar habit of blending in seamlessly until she unleashed a flurry of surprises. Both women remind us that pirate life was less romanticized freedom and more controlled chaos with a side of theatrics. Speaking of theatrics, let's take a brief moment to talk about Black Bart Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate you've probably never really studied. He captured over 400 ships in his career, which, if you think about it, is absurd. 400. That's more than most people will ever own. And yet Roberts was meticulous, almost obsessive about rules. His crew had a code of conduct, a pirate constitution, if you will. No gambling on Sundays, fair distribution of plunder, rules about cleanliness. Yes, pirates had hygiene rules. The ocean is winded like that. Roberts is a fascinating example of how human beings, even when engaged in chaos, crave order. And, of course, he eventually died in a storm, because apparently the universe insists on irony. Now, let's gently drift toward the daily humdrum of pirate life. It wasn't all rum and treasure maps. Much of it involved maintenance. Ships had to be repaired constantly, ropes replaced, sails patched. Food had to be rationed, often dried, salted, or infested with weevils. Water was stored in barrels, which is charmingly unappealing after a few weeks at sea. Crew disputes could escalate quickly, sometimes over minor things like who got the last hardtack biscuit. Pirates might have been lawless, but they were also petty, grumpy, and very human. And sleep? Oh, sleep on a pirate ship is an exercise in patience and strategic positioning. Hammocks were cramped, swaying and liable to tip at the wrong moment. Storms turned even the bravest pirates into groaning, soggy sacks of regret. And let's not forget the smells. Unwashed bodies, brine, spoiled food, and the faint undertone of desperation. It's hard to romanticize that, yet somehow, tales of pirates emphasize excitement, adventure, and treasure chests. Probably because reality isn't as entertaining as legend. Let's float over to the myth versus reality of treasure. Many people picture pirates burying gold on tropical islands marked with X's. In truth, pirates usually spent loot quickly for food, alcohol, repairs, or gambling. Burying treasure was rare. If you did bury gold, it was often a temporary stash, and someone would probably steal it later anyway. The famous X marks the spot scenario is largely a literary invention, popularized centuries after the golden age of piracy. Even the romantic notion of the Jolly Roger, the iconic skull and crossbones flag, was mostly symbolic intimidation. Pirates used it strategically, not because they wanted to look cool, though of course they did. If a ship surrendered quickly, no bloodshed was necessary, and that's efficient, if slightly anticlimactic. Pirates were clever, pragmatic, and sometimes surprisingly humane, at least by the violent standards of the 17th and 18th centuries. So, as we glide toward the end of this segment, it's worth reflecting on the strange contrast between legend and reality. Pirates were terrifying when necessary, quirky when convenient, and constantly caught between boredom, chaos, and survival. They weren't glamorous, but they were undeniably human. Messy, stubborn, occasionally heroic, often ridiculous, and always memorable. As your eyelids start to feel heavier, imagine drifting on a gently rocking ship, the sea humming beneath you, a cold breeze carrying the faint smell of salt and unwashed bodies. Somewhere, a pirate argues over the last slice of bread. Somewhere else, a woman dressed as a man flips a coin and smirks at the absurdity of it all. And somewhere in the distance, a storm quietly reminds everyone that nature, not legend, is ultimately in charge. All right, let's settle in again. Maybe adjust your pillow, sip something warm if you like, and imagine the gentle sway of a ship as we continue wandering through the surprisingly strange lives of pirates. We left off with the legends and the reality of treasure, and now we'll drift into the little absurdities that made pirate life uniquely piratey. First, let's talk food, because the diet of a pirate was, in many ways, a tragedy disguised as sustenance. Fresh meat? Rare. Fruit and vegetables? Almost mythical. The staple was salted meat, hardtack, which is basically flavorless cardboard in biscuit form, and occasionally fish. Water was stored in barrels, which often turned foul within a week. Alcohol, usually rum, was not just for fun. It doubled as a disinfectant and morale booster. Crew members drank it diluted with water, called grog. So imagine your daily menu being salty wet biscuits, questionable meat, and rum water. Glamorous, isn't it? And yet, somehow, this diet fueled the so-called fearsome pirates. Humans are weirdly adaptable. Now, speaking of adaptability, pirates developed some of the oddest hygiene practices, or lack thereof. Bathing was rare because water at sea was expensive or dangerous to collect. Laundry? Forget it. Clothing was reused until it literally fell apart. But pirates had other ways of coping. They'd smoke pipes, apply oils, or rub strong-smelling herbs on themselves to mask odors. Some even bathed in seawater when convenient, which, if you think about it, is basically taking a lukewarm, salty shower while hoping no one notices the blisters. Charming, right? Let's float over to pirate superstitions, because yes, even these fearless chaos worshippers had weird rules. Black cats were good luck. Whistling on a ship could summon a storm. A pirate stepping on a rope in the wrong direction might bring doom upon the entire crew. And you thought modern workplace rules were strict. Pirates, despite all their lawlessness, believed in a very specific kind of magical logic. Break the rules, and you risked more than HR complaints. You risked your life. And sometimes it really wasn't just superstition. Storms and accidents reinforced their beliefs. Now, we can't ignore mutiny, which was a constant backdrop to pirates' existence. A bored, hungry, or drunk crew is unpredictable, and leadership depended heavily on respect, charisma, and sometimes sheer luck. Pirate captains often earned their positions by demonstrating skill, fearlessness, or the ability to persuade a crew to follow them through miserable conditions. Some, like Henry Avery, were charming, strategic, and terrifying all at once. Others, less so. Less competent captains were sometimes overthrown mid-voyage, and it wasn't just because they were cruel. It could be that they were indecisive, lazy, or simply unlucky. Imagine being deposed because you forgot to ration the biscuits properly. It's cruel, but historically accurate. Let's float over to Edward Teach. Yes, Blackbeard himself, but not for his dramatic beard. Rather for his eccentric habits. He would reportedly tie slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle, creating a terrifying, smoky visage. Practical? Not really. Effective? Debatably. Dramatic? Absolutely. Blackbeard also preferred intimidation over unnecessary bloodshed, which aligns with our theme. Pirates were clever, messy, and occasionally theatrical. The fearsome legend of Blackbeard is a mixture of real terror, exaggeration by terrified merchants, and a touch of
We must tell a good story or we'll die bored. Moving from terror to tragedy, let's consider the lives of pirate families, because many pirates had loved ones on shore, often forgotten in stories of cannonballs and treasure maps. Letters were sometimes sent, mostly complaining about boredom, storms, or crew antics. Children growing up without their parents' guidance, lovers left behind waiting for uncertain returns. These human details get lost in the lore of cannonballs and treasure maps. Pirates were not just caricatures. They were people who endured long absences, harsh conditions, and the occasional existential crisis on the rolling sea. And here's a particularly sleepy yet oddly entertaining detail: pirate fashion beyond the Jolly Roger. Coats were often patched, hats acquired opportunistically, and shoes a rare luxury. Jewelry, if present, was more often currency than decoration. Pirates liked to look a little intimidating, yes, but they also had to survive storms and keep their clothing functional. So when you imagine a pirate strutting on deck in shiny boots, remember the reality: damp socks, tattered coats, and hair that has never met a comb. Yet somehow the image of glamorous rebel persists. Let's gently drift toward health issues, because pirates, like anyone else, weren't immune to the absurdities of biology. Scurvy was rampant, thanks to vitamin C deficiency. Dental problems were common, leading to a generation of terrifying smiles. Injuries, infections, and parasites were everyday occurrences. And yet, pirates persisted, adapted, and occasionally thrived, despite literally every practical reason not to. There's a quiet kind of admiration in that stubborn survival. Transitioning from bodily concerns to more psychological ones, pirates often experienced long bouts of boredom, punctuated by intense excitement. Days could pass in endless tedium, punctuated by short bursts of adrenaline during raids or storms. This combination could make a pirate either brilliant or completely unhinged. And history gives us plenty of examples of unhinged. Men and women at sea for months, living in close quarters with limited hygiene, limited food, and limited patience, occasionally engaged in bizarre rituals, odd games, or petty feuds that would seem absurd if not tragic. Now, let's pause for a slightly more whimsical figure: Stede Bonnet, known as the gentleman pirate. Unlike most pirates, Bonnet came from wealth and privilege, which, in a pirate context, is basically like bringing a tuxedo to a mud fight. He purchased a ship and tried his hand at piracy, often relying heavily on his crew for actual expertise. He was not particularly competent at the pirate lifestyle. Navigation, leadership, battle tactics, all somewhat out of his comfort zone. Yet somehow, his attempts have cemented him in history. Gentlemen pirates are rare, mostly because aristocrats tend to dislike sleeping in hammocks and arguing over salted pork. Let's drift again to pirate democracy, because it's a quietly fascinating aspect of pirate life. Many crews elected captains and shared loot based on agreed-upon rules. Pirate codes, surprisingly detailed, governed compensation, medical care, and even punishments for theft or cowardice. Compare that to monarchies or corporations of the same era, and pirates were strangely progressive. The paradox is delicious. People considered lawless, chaotic marauders were in some ways more egalitarian than the societies that condemned them. Finally, let's glide into the end of pirate life, which was rarely glamorous. Many pirates died from disease, storms, or capture. Executions were common for captured pirates, often by hanging, which historical accounts suggest could be disturbingly bureaucratic in nature. But not all ended in tragedy. Some retired quietly, settling in ports, running inns, or living off past plunders. Even then, stories were embellished. A pirate who retired quietly might still be remembered as a fearsome marauder because, well, storytelling is more fun than reality. As we drift toward the end of this part, imagine the gentle chaos of pirate life, the waves rocking the ship, crew members bickering over provisions, someone discreetly mending a torn sail, another sneaking a bit of rum. It's messy, imperfect, occasionally tragic, and quietly human. And somehow that messiness has captured imaginations for centuries. So, as your eyelids grow heavier, picture a pirate lounging in a hammock, scowling at the ocean and muttering about biscuits, rumors of treasure, and why no one appreciates his fashion sense. Somewhere a storm approaches, somewhere else a daring raid is planned, but for now everything is calm, quiet, and just a little ridiculous. And that, my friends, is the strangely soothing truth of pirate life. Less swords and treasure, more soggy bread, stubborn personalities, and
All right, let's settle in again. Maybe adjust your blanket so it doesn't slide off, and drift gently back into the rolling waves of pirate existence. We've covered the basics: legend versus reality, food, hygiene, female pirates, and quirky captains. Now let's float into the more peculiar and sometimes quietly tragicomic episodes of pirate history. One of the things people rarely mention is the sheer absurdity of pirate raids gone wrong. Pirates were not always cunning, victorious, or dramatically terrifying. Often, a raid would involve hours of shouting, awkward maneuvering, and mistaken assumptions. Imagine dozens of people swinging cutlasses at the wrong ship, or boarding only to realize they had attacked a vessel filled with nuns. Yes, there are accounts of pirates accidentally harassing completely non-threatening ships, resulting in embarrassment and occasionally awkward apologies or a hasty retreat. The reality of fearsome marauder life is sometimes a comedy of errors, slowly rocking on the high seas. Speaking of errors, let's drift to pirates who were bad at being pirates. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate we met earlier, is the poster child for this. He tried to adopt the pirate persona without truly understanding what it required. He hired skilled sailors, dressed flamboyantly, and occasionally attempted raids, but often failed spectacularly. At one point, he and Blackbeard collaborated, which probably should have been a smart move. Instead, it highlighted Bonnet's incompetence. Imagine the most polite, overly dressed man you know trying to run a criminal enterprise in the middle of the ocean. It's tragic, ridiculous, and strangely comforting, because even pirates had bad days. Let's float over to pirates and their pets, which is an oddly underappreciated topic. Some pirates kept monkeys, parrots, or dogs aboard ships. The parrot, of course, became iconic, largely because it's dramatic and squawks at the perfect pitch. But in reality, animals on board were messy, occasionally aggressive, and required care amidst storms and cramped quarters. Feeding a monkey while the ship pitches violently is probably a lesson in humility. And yet, somehow, the image of the swashbuckling pirate with a parrot on his shoulder persists, charmingly impractical. Now on to the psychology of pirate infamy. Pirates often cultivated reputations that were larger than life. For example, Black Sam Bellamy, known as the Prince of Pirates, combined charisma, tactical skill, and some very good luck. He was young, handsome, and loved by his crew. Yet his story ends quietly tragic. He died in a storm, drowning just as quickly as he had risen. The irony here is deliciously bittersweet. Someone so feared and admired in life could be undone by forces completely beyond control. It's a gentle reminder that, for pirates, the sea dictated far more than reputation or bravery. Let's drift to pirate escapes and arrests, which are often more interesting in their mundane absurdity than any cinematic version. Pirates captured by authorities didn't always go down swinging. Sometimes they were caught due to being conspicuously bad at hiding, sloppy bookkeeping, or just a streak of very bad luck. There are accounts of pirates being arrested because they didn't pay attention to local regulations or were betrayed by a crewmate who thought it was funny. Trials were often dramatic, filled with rhetoric and moral posturing, but execution, usually by hanging, was routine, quiet, and bureaucratic. Not exactly swashbuckling glory, but historically accurate. Speaking of quiet tragedies, let's float toward the daily, crushing boredom of long voyages. Days could stretch into weeks, filled with monotonous chores, scrubbing the deck, repairing sails, rationing food, or patching ropes. Pirates, despite their reputation for chaos, spent much of their lives enduring tedium. It's a detail often ignored in romanticized accounts. Imagine months at sea, nothing happening, waves rocking you to sleep, the same arguments about rations, and the constant threat of storms. It's repetitive, slow, and slightly miserable, perfectly suited for our bedtime story approach. Now let's consider pirate punishments within the crew, because pirates had their own informal judicial system. Stealing from the crew, cowardice in battle, or breaking agreed-upon codes often resulted in fines, flogging, or marooning. Marooning is particularly grim, abandoning someone on a deserted island with minimal supplies, essentially leaving them to die or survive alone. Yet, even these punishments were rarely violent for the sake of cruelty. They were pragmatic measures designed to maintain order in an otherwise chaotic environment. Pirates were anarchist, yes, but pragmatic too. Drifting toward female pirates again, because their stories are endlessly fascinating, we have Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who after capture were spared immediate execution because they were pregnant. Historical accounts suggest they might have returned to quiet lives afterwards, although details are murky. Their existence challenges the typical narrative. Pirates were not just men brawling over rum. Women also participated, with courage, cunning, and occasionally stylish disguises. And they remind us that the golden age of piracy was, despite stereotypes, occasionally inclusive, if selectively so. Now, a soft pivot to pirate superstitions that shaped daily behavior. Beyond black cats and whistling, pirates were meticulous about omens. Some refused to sail on certain days, avoided picking up particular objects, or had rituals to ward off bad luck. Ships had to be blessed in some sense, and any unusual phenomenon, fog, lightning, or a sudden bird, might inspire caution. It's strangely relatable. Humans everywhere, even those living lawlessly at sea, crave patterns, explanations, and small rituals to feel safe. Now let's drift into the economics of piracy, because money, even for outlaws, was important. Plunder was divided according to codes, with the captain usually receiving a slightly larger share. Medical injuries were compensated. Investments in weaponry, food, and ship repairs were sometimes communal. And yet, despite all this planning, piracy was financially risky. Many pirates died before they could enjoy wealth,
while others squandered it in days. The pattern is almost painfully human: ambition, risk, occasional brilliance, and a touch of mismanagement. Finally, let's gently explore the legacy of pirates, which is both exaggerated and oddly comforting. The myths, treasure maps, hidden chests, flamboyant costumes, persist because humans love narrative. But the reality, tattered clothes, boredom, minor victories, and a lot of rum, is equally compelling, if less cinematic. Pirates were messy, inventive, petty, and occasionally heroic. Their stories endure because they reflect our fascination with rebellion, chaos, and survival under absurd circumstances. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine a pirate leaning against the railing, looking at a calm sea, the wind gently tugging at their coat. Somewhere behind them, the crew argues quietly about rations, someone hums a melancholy tune, and the occasional parrot squawks insistently. The sea is calm, the horizon stretches infinitely, and for a few moments, everything is quiet, absurd, and just slightly magical. And with that, we leave the pirates not as terrifying marauders, but as messy, oddly human figures, surviving, scheming, bickering, and occasionally thriving on the ridiculous, quiet chaos of their lives.
All right, let's ease back into the gentle sway of the sea. But this time, we'll wander toward pirate ports, taverns, and harbors, the occasional shoreside chaos that made pirate life both exciting and frustrating. Remember, we're not chasing swords or treasure chests in cinematic fashion. Instead, we're floating through the quietly absurd and sometimes tragicomic realities of pirate society. First, consider the life of pirates on land, which was often less glamorous than stories suggest. Ports were noisy, crowded, and sometimes surprisingly bureaucratic. Pirates had to resupply, repair ships, and find somewhere to spend their ill-gotten gains. Taverns were a popular destination, which meant loud arguments over drinks, gambling disputes, and occasional bar brawls. Money, in fact, often vanished faster than it arrived. And yes, pirates occasionally invested in civilian pursuits, taverns, brothels, and minor trade. But even these ventures were fraught with mismanagement, because being terrible at bookkeeping seems to be a recurring theme in pirate history. Let's drift gently toward some lesser-known pirates whose lives are quietly fascinating. Christopher Condent, for example, operated in the Indian Ocean, far from the Caribbean, and captured large ships with surprising cunning. Unlike the Hollywood heroes, Condent spent much of his life navigating politics, storms, and the occasional mutinous crew. Strategy mattered more than flamboyant costumes. It's a subtle reminder that pirates weren't all chaos. Some were quietly brilliant tacticians, calculating risks that most of us would barely comprehend. Then there's Blackbeard Roberts, whom we briefly met earlier, but his later exploits deserve more attention. Roberts was strict with his crew, enforcing rules about cleanliness and fair plunder distribution. In some ways, he resembled a combination of military officer and accountant, a terrifyingly efficient pirate. His success stemmed from consistency, ruthless when needed, fair when convenient, and always aware that a disorganized crew equals disaster. Eventually, he died in battle, which is poetic in a very quiet, oceanic way. Someone who mastered chaos, undone by the unpredictability of the sea. Now let's drift toward pirate traditions and quirks. Pirates had rituals for departure and arrival,
songs for morale, and a surprising attachment to superstitions. Some believed burying treasure in an X-marked spot could magically protect it, despite the rarity of actually doing so. Some carried lucky charms, including coins, rings, or oddly shaped stones. And when storms approached, pirates often paused for quiet reflection or ritual. It's a reminder that even those who lived outside the law still sought comfort, control, and patterns in a world dominated by unpredictable waves. Port towns also hosted pirate communities, where ex-pirates, retired marauders, and schemers mingled. Stories of past exploits circulated, often exaggerated, feeding the mythos of piracy. Some pirates married locally, raising families in relative quiet. Others vanished, either to return to the sea or quietly fade from memory. Human life, even in the lawless context of piracy, remained surprisingly mundane. Drama existed, yes, but so did the quiet moments. A pirate nursing a hangover, repairing sails, or quietly counting coins. Let's float gently to the gradual decline of piracy, a process as slow and unglamorous as the sea itself. By the early 18th century, increased naval patrols, treaties, and stricter laws made piracy more dangerous. Pirate havens were disrupted. Wealthy merchants invested in privateers and armed convoys. The golden age faded because the risks gradually outweighed the rewards. And yet the legends endured, growing in drama and absurdity with each retelling. The reality was quieter. Pirates either died, retired, or were captured. Not a single dramatic, epic duel on the quarterdeck moment in most cases. Speaking of retirement, let's consider pirates who survived to live quietly, which is far more common than the stories suggest. Some settled in port towns, married, and invested plunder in farms or businesses. Their lives away from the ocean were often dull in comparison to the swashbuckling myths, but probably healthier. A pirate who traded chaos for stability is, in a quiet way, the most relatable of all. They survived, which is more than can be said for the romanticized, heroic deaths in lore. And as we drift toward the legends and ghost stories of pirates, it's worth noting that much of the spooky allure comes from exaggeration. Tales of cursed treasure, haunted ships, and phantom pirates at sea are mostly literary inventions. Pirates themselves were superstitious, yes, but the ghostly encounters often served more as cautionary tales than actual experiences. The human imagination is much more terrifying than reality, which is why the stories endure. A storm at night, a creaking ship, and a howling wind are far more dramatic than the mundane truth of wet sails and a slightly grumpy crew. And finally, let's imagine a quiet evening in a pirate port. Lanterns flickering, the smell of salt and rum, sailors arguing over maps or minor grievances. Somewhere, someone nurses a parrot. Elsewhere, a woman dressed as a man quietly counts coins. Ships sway gently in the harbor, while the occasional drunk stumbles along the dock. Life is simultaneously chaotic and ordinary, full of personality, minor disasters, and small triumphs. And in that ordinary chaos, the legends of pirates quietly grow, inflated by human memory, imagination, and the occasional dramatic retelling. So as you feel your eyelids droop and the sea hums in the background, remember, pirates were not flawless heroes, terrifying villains, or purely romantic figures. They were messy, inventive, slightly ridiculous humans trying to survive in a harsh world. Their stories, amplified by time, have become legend. But the true tales are quieter, more absurd, and oddly comforting. And with that gentle reflection, Imagine a pirate leaning against a railing, sipping grog, watching the horizon, while a parrot squawks insistently nearby. Somewhere behind them, a hammock swings, a rope frays slightly, and the waves hum a slow, soothing rhythm. It's chaotic, yes, but perfectly ordinary for those living on the edge of law, myth, and the open sea.
All right, let's gently float back to the sea one last time, imagining the soft sway of the waves, lanterns flickering on the decks of distant ships, and the faint smell of salt and rum. Tonight, we'll drift through the lighter, more peculiar, and quietly absurd aspects of pirate life that history rarely emphasizes, and then ease into the enduring cultural echoes they left behind. First, let's consider the quirky personal habits of pirates. Many had rituals that seem odd to us, but made sense in context. Some captains had extremely specific morning routines, involving counting coins, inspecting weapons, or delivering long-winded motivational speeches to a crew that was mostly listening because they had nothing better to do. Others had odd obsessions, collecting trinkets, studying maps obsessively, or carrying bizarre charms. One pirate reportedly refused to touch food with his left hand because of a superstition, which may have slowed down meal preparation considerably. The important thing here is that pirates, for all their chaos, had patterns, routines, and idiosyncrasies, tiny islands of control in a vast, unpredictable world. Then there are pirate rivalries, which were as petty as they were dramatic. Two crews might feud for months over a single ship or port, with much posturing, shouting, and occasional cannon fire. Often, these rivalries ended quietly. Someone surrendered because they were tired, hungry, or bored. Violence was expensive, exhausting, and inconvenient. The legends of epic pirate battles are mostly condensed versions of a lot of shouting, a few cannon blasts, and long waits in the sun. It's almost comforting to imagine that even pirates got tired of drama. Let's drift toward humorous failures, which are plentiful in the historical record. Some pirates attempted elaborate raids only to realize they had misread a map, attacked the wrong target, or ran aground. Others spent days planning a daring escape from naval authorities, only to stumble into an even more inconvenient storm. And then there's the quiet absurdity of some pirate fashion choices: hats, feathers, oversized coats, and jewelry that made them visible targets rather than intimidating figures. Their lives were a mix of bravery, incompetence, and occasional flair for the dramatic. Now, a gentle note on the decline of individual infamy. As navies became more organized and shipping more secure, pirates had fewer opportunities to make a name for themselves. Those who tried were often caught, retired quietly, or simply faded into obscurity. Yet the myths persisted. We remember Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and Calico Jack because storytelling magnifies the memorable. The many average pirates who survived quietly or failed spectacularly without renown are mostly forgotten. And in their obscurity, they remind us that not all lives need to be legendary to be humanly interesting. Let's drift into the humor of pirate superstition one last time because it's quietly delightful. Pirates believed in curses, magical treasures, and omens, sometimes rightly, sometimes hilariously wrong. A strange bird could signal doom, a cracked mirror could bring misfortune, and burying treasure was sometimes considered protective magic. Yet in practice, these rituals were mostly reassurance. Humans need rituals, even when chaos surrounds them, and pirates were no exception. It's oddly soothing to imagine a crew pausing mid-brawl to ensure they've properly appeased the sea gods,
or at least the spirit of whichever parrot they believed was unlucky that day. Now, a gentle drift toward piracy's camaraderie, which is perhaps the most human aspect of their existence. Despite superstition, petty theft, and occasional mutiny, pirates often formed deep bonds. They shared meals, argued endlessly, supported one another in battle, and sometimes mourned losses quietly. Even the notorious pirates with fearsome reputations were in private just humans struggling to survive, occasionally laughing at absurd situations, and sometimes caring for one another in subtle, understated ways. Now, let's imagine an evening in a pirate port, hammocks swaying, lanterns reflecting in the water, parrots squawking in the background, and pirates quietly repairing sails or polishing weapons. Somewhere, a crew debates the fairness of loot division, while a captain reviews maps and grumbles about an upcoming storm. And somewhere else, a woman disguised as a man counts coins, planning her next small adventure. Life is chaotic, messy, and quietly absurd, but in a way that feels perfectly natural, like a slow, rolling lullaby. Now, drifting toward piracy's cultural legacy, it's fascinating to see how myth outshines reality. Today, pirates appear in novels, films, cartoons, and bedtime stories. Their image is stylized: dramatic coats, eye patches, parrots, and treasure chests. The truth is quieter: tattered clothing, boredom, petty disputes, superstitions, and the occasional triumph or failure. Yet the myth persists, because humans love a good story. Pirates embody rebellion, adventure, and the absurdity of life on the edge, all filtered through imagination and exaggeration. And finally, let's gently reflect on why pirate history is oddly soothing when told like this. Their lives were messy, tragic, absurd, and human, often more funny than terrifying, more mundane than epic, yet full of character. They remind us that even in chaos, humans create routines, superstitions, communities, and small victories. They remind us that life, even when dangerous and uncomfortable, is also deeply human and quietly amusing. And they remind us, perhaps most importantly, that legends are built from ordinary, messy lives that are sometimes more entertaining in retrospect than in reality. So, as your eyes grow heavier and the sea hums a slow, endless rhythm, picture the final scene: a pirate leaning lazily against the railing, grog in hand, lanterns flickering behind him. The ship sways gently. Somewhere, a parrot squawks. A hammock swings quietly. Waves lap softly against the hull. And somewhere in that vast, rolling ocean, the human chaos of piracy quietly persists in memory, myth, and imagination. Sleep now, gently, with the faint echo of distant waves and the quiet absurdity of pirate life lingering, reminding you that even the wildest, most chaotic lives are just people trying to survive, bicker, laugh, and occasionally succeed in the small, ridiculous ways that make life memorable.